gold and silver and other things from the new world that was coming. They went around the world, they went everywhere on the knowledge given to them by Africans. And that knowledge, finding the colonies, finding Brazil, finding Hispaniola, finding Cuba, finding the Americas, they needed labor. And a lot of the Moors that had been enslaved, that stayed in Spain and Portugal, do you know, a lot of them were taken and chained in slave ships and brought to the Caribbean and to the Americas. So a lot of the Moors did come over, those that had been enslaved, those that had been driven out. Some that were not the massacred, many had been massacred, hundreds and thousands had been massacred, but lots of them came over. So originally, and another thing, the Moors had taught them how to handle their vineyards, how to make wine. Spain and Portugal today are great wine producing companies. They learned that from the Moors. They learned that. The same thing with their Moroccan leather, their gold, all of that was learned from the Moors. Everything that they have that constituted their culture and civilization came out of that period, that 711 way up to 1492 and 1497 came out of the Moors. So lots of the Africans that they had brought to work, they had brought people to work vineyards and to work in Spain and in Portugal. They took, initially, Prince Henry and the others took these men and brought them, took them to the Caribbean. The very first Africans that were brought enslaved to the Caribbean, many of them came from Spain and Portugal. And later on, with the conquering of parts of Africa, they began to take Africans to bring them to the same, because Spain was only interested in gold. Spain was not interested in sugar cane or anything at the time, initially. Neither was Portugal. They were interested in bringing gold. The gold mines of Spain had been depleted. The resources of gold were necessary when Aragon and Castile joined together with Isabella and Ferdinand. So they needed all this gold, and the gold was being taken away from the Caribbean, away from the Americas, and brought back there. So initially, a lot of the Africans that were in Spain and were in Portugal, many of them were taken to the Caribbean. And later on, when Columbus, was told by, the Caribs and the Arawaks and the others refused to work on gold mines and refused to look for gold, they decided the next best would be Africans. As Las Casas said, Las Casas is the one that plunged Africa into this slave trade, and they began to come in great numbers. So that is how really Spain and Portugal began. And they were the first two countries to benefit up to especially Spain, up until the 16th century. Spain was the most powerful and richest country in the slave trade and slavery in the Caribbean. It is when the Spanish Navy began to lose power as a sea power, and Britain began to take hold, and Holland began to control the seas from Europe to the Caribbean, especially the Caribbean waters, where lots of these wars were fought. These naval battles were fought for possession of the Caribbean. It was then that Spain began to lose out, and Britain and France and Holland began to take over. So the whole thing was, and then at that time, the slave trade was in full swing, slavery was in full swing. And so they were the ones initially responsible for doing that, searching for gold, searching for silver. But you know, from about 1513, right up until 1660, that's the early years. The 1513 is the years of the Asiento, the contract that was formed by Britain and others to furnish Spain with slaves and to furnish slaves with Africans, especially with the...
Say that again now.
The Asiento, when Britain was not actually involved in the slave trade in 1513. It was Spain and they've had this contract where the British was supplying Spain with slaves every year on a contract that they had signed. And one of the leading slavers at the time was the great Sir John Hawkins, who was knighted later on by Queen Elizabeth. For what? For taking Africans, enslaving them, and bringing them to the Caribbean.
What does that say about the value system of the European?
The value system is a monetary system. You know, it is a system of materialism, power, And that's what it has been based on. It hasn't been based on greed for power, greed for money. And Dr. Eric Williams puts it very well in his book. And it was said by the late Sir Winston Churchill in one of his great volumes called The History of the English-Speaking People. Williams said the seeds of capitalism were sown on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. And Sir Winston Churchill, in his book, the Prime Minister of England during the Second World War, he wrote in his book called, in his two-volume book, The History of the English-Speaking People, that were it not for the sugarcane plantations of the Caribbean, the Industrial Revolution in England and Europe would have failed. It was the monies made from sugar and sugarcane that really started off and made Britain take a step forward in the Industrial Revolution and put Britain ahead of other places in Europe. That is why after a time, Britain owned a vast empire that covered 3/4 of the world. When they said the sun never sets on the British Empire, they were not lying, they were speaking the truth, because Britain owned a vast empires in the east and in the west, and the monies were used to develop the technology and the industry and the commerce and everything in England. In point of fact, all the merchant banks in the early years, in the 18th century, were formed from monies from the slave trade and slavery. All of it. Yeah. Barclays and all the other banks. Lloyd's of London used to be a coffee house where occasionally one day they had a few men who would insure some slaves. A few captains would come there, and people who got slaves from Africa, they would insure them. Lloyd's of London was merely a coffee house where they conducted this transaction.
Lloyd's of London being
the great big Lloyd's of London today.
Insurance.
That's how it started. The biggest insurance company in the world started on the blood of African slaves. Barclays, William Barclay, his brother, Barclays Bank began that way. All the banks, the merchant banks of London. I'm talking about the City of London, where the Bank of England is, in Threadneedle Street. All of these banks started on monies that they made out of the slaves. Not only that, when slavery was abolished in the Caribbean, they gave the plantation owners compensation for the slaves. They paid them sums of money for their slaves, for losing the labor of their slaves. The Africans got nothing at all. And the monies that were made by all the Beckfords and the others, the Codringtons and the others, these monies were used to start great businesses and to start big concerns in England and in parts of the Caribbean.
So in a real sense, the Africans were working and providing a type of welfare thing for Europeans.
Quite, but that is exactly what was taking place at the time. That is why I feel that reparations are necessary, because in that time, Parliament of England, Holland, France, they passed laws paying every plantation owner money for the loss of the labor of the slaves when the emancipation of the slaves came around. And they didn't give the slaves anything. One or two leaders of the time, a man called Victor Cherochet, he was a big leader, he was a sort of emancipator in the French island of Martinique and Guadeloupe. He was the one that made out a case for Africans being paid compensation for their labor. Do you know what was said in the parliament in France and what was said in England when that was being debated? Africans will not know what to do with the money. The same thing they're saying today about Africans. They don't know what to do with their money. Same thing. Ain't nothing changed.
What can you tell us about Africans in Italy and miscegenation, etc.?
Wherever the Moors were, in Italy, even a part of in France, in Tours, Tours, there was miscegenation on a vast scale. And there's a place in south of France today that's called La Petite Afrique, and it's there where the Moors had settled in that part of the famous Riviera part. La Petite Afrique is it's called. And because a lot of the descendants of the people there are Moors. In Italy, it was the same thing, from the very highest to the lowest. One of the highest the families in Italy in the time of the early part of the 18th century was the Medicis. They were great people. They were the dukes and so on. The Duke of Florence was Alessandro Medici. They called him the Moor. His mother was an African woman called Anna, and his father was a great member of one of the Medicis, a great member of the royal family, of the Italian royal family. Alessandro Medici, he's known in history, he's written down in European history books as the Moor. And when you look, there's a picture of him, when you look at his picture, you can see that quite easily. That it's the same thing with some of the royal family of Portugal. You know, John of Portugal is the same thing. And you look at him with his crinkly hair and his thickish lips and his nose and so on. There's no two way. In point of fact, you know, people at the time who knew him and saw him, that is why they call him the Portuguese Negro. They call him that. You know, they don't hesitate to call him that. And lots of members of the royal family.
Now, how did Africans fare in the Catholic Church? Can you deal with that?
You know, there was a time North Africa was called Africa Romana, and that is where the Catholic faith began to grow at that, in the early years, in the 3rd and the 4th century. It began to grow there. And Africans were so popular and so powerful, played such a powerful part, that you not only had saints of the Catholic Church that were Africans, but you had popes, African popes that are well known. And if you go to the Vatican, Monsignor Cardinal O'Connor will tell you, anybody will tell you. For instance, the 14th Pope after St. Peter was an African Pope called Victor I. And many people, priests and monsignors and so on, will tell you. But he was the one that was responsible for observing the feast of Easter on a Sunday. He was the one that introduced what they call the Ambrosian chant in the church rituals of the Catholic, the church liturgy of the Catholic faith. He was a great pope. He's been made a saint, and he's venerated in the Vatican. The other pope that came after him was Pope Miltiades. He was in 311 AD. The first one, Victor, was 149 AD. Miltiades came on in 311 AD. He was also a great. Most of the property that the governors and so on had confiscated in Rome, he got most of the property. In fact, where the Vatican is now, he was the one responsible for getting all those lands for the Catholic Church. Many lands that had been taken during the intensive thing between the Catholics, and they had to hide in the catacombs and so. Most of these lands were got through that Pope, and he was the one who unified not only the Catholic faith in North Africa and in Europe, but he was the one also, the Catholic faith with the Asian priests and bishops and so on. He got them all together, especially at that time. You remember the Nicene Conference came around 325 AD, you remember, when they began to give some kind of methodology, then put it this way, to the liturgy and the practice of the Catholic Church. The last pope was a man called Gelasius I, Saint Gelasius I. He was a pope in 492 AD, and he was a man that all the big charity organizations of the Catholic Church we have today, he was the one that started them. He lived a monastic life, and he lived a life of he protected all the teachings of the church more than any other of the popes at the time. So these are three of them. And the father of the Catholic Church, if you're going to a seminary and you're going to be a Catholic priest, you have to do the works of St. Augustine. St. Augustine, everyone knows he's an African. Everybody knows.
So how did we get to Stephen Fetchit and J.J. in Good Times and George Jefferson and the Lazy Negro? How did we and the Tarzan movies? And I'm saying that on the heels of what you've just said about the presence of Africans in the Catholic Church, the Moors in Spain, Portugal, etc. But how do we get to this lazy, unintelligent Negro, if you will?
One of the worst things that could happen to Africans and I know a lot of scholars agree with that. Van Sertimer, Acer, and the others, they all agree with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. It went on for hundreds of years, and they had to project that the people that they were dealing with had no kind of feelings of humanity in them. In fact, there was a concerted effort right during the time of slavery to prove and to show that Africans did not measure up to the kind of intelligence and education of Europeans. I'll give you some concrete examples. Although they had African scholars, African musicians, they had people like Jacob Capitan, who was a professor at the University of Leiden. There was William Amo, who was in the professor got his doctorate in 1740 at the University of Wittenberg. There was also Juan Latino, who taught philosophy at the University of Granada. These men were scholars, accepted as scholars. They're well-known scholars. But that was during the slave trade. One of the leading interpreters, a man who spoke many languages, was a Fulani slave called Job Ben Solomon. He could speak 7 different languages, and the Royal African Company used him as an interpreter on slave ships coming from Africa and going to Britain and to France and to going to the Americas. They used him as an interpreter, but not only African language he was fluent at. German, Dutch, English, French, you just name it. The man spoke, he jumped from one to the other. And when at that time slavery was at its height, when in England in that period of the 18th century, up to that time, there had never been an English version of the Holy Quran. Not one English scholar, including the great Dr. Samuel Johnson, could translate and to get an English edition of the Holy Quran. You know who they got to do it for them? An African. They got Job Ben Solomon. He translated the Quran for them almost by memory. You can go to the British Museum now and see the copy of the translation of the Holy Quran by Ben Solomon. He was lionized. The salons of England, they lionized him. The ladies and the lords, they had him everywhere, saying this African would rise to the... And yet, they had slaves and slaves. They were saying, the historians at the time, Gilbert Franklin, Edward Long, Samuel Estwick, you just name these English historians. They were saying that Africans could not measure up to an English, a European education. So much so that John, the second Duke of Montague, who was a lieutenant governor in Jamaica and owned an estate in Jamaica called Orange River Estate, a slave. He took a little boy, a little slave boy from that plantation, sent him to England, his people, for them to see if that little boy, a little 2-year-old boy he took, and to see if he could absorb an English education. He called him Francis Williams. Why did he pick the boy? The reason he gives, because he was quick moving about the place. He had quick darting black eyes. So any little dark child with darting black eyes is bright. This is what this man said. Took him to England, educated him almost from kindergarten. The boy did so well. They sent him eventually from elementary school to grammar school. And he did so well in grammar school that they had to send him not to the most difficult college in England, up to the university in England up to today. That's Cambridge is the most difficult college to get a degree in England. More than Oxford. Not that Oxford is not, but Cambridge is very difficult. They sent him to Cambridge. He got his, what they call his PPE, philosophy, psychology, and economics. He got that degree. You're supposed to take 4 years. He got it in 3.5 years. This brilliant boy. When he gave his graduate exercises, he gave his speech. You know what he gave it in? He spoke in Latin. Well, a lot of them couldn't understand, as you can imagine. But this guy became so great that...
Isn't that at the bottom of what we are confronted with today as African people around the world? Not that we cannot produce, cannot think, but that we may think too well and produce too much. Is that at the bottom of it, you think?
And therein lies the danger. therein lies the danger as far as they're concerned. Because when a person can control himself and can educate himself or herself to that standard, you cannot control the person anymore. Power is going to slip from your hands.
Now, you say African blood also runs in Germany's veins. Would you discuss that a little bit, please?
A lot of the Huns, they call the people they call the Huns. They were Mongolian people, a lot of them were of African descent. A lot of them were in England, and many of the people we call...
Let me stop you there, because people listening to this might say, well, you know, Africans here on this part of the planet, Africans over there, Africans over here. It should be stated that, once again, that African people were the first people on the planet. So maybe it stands to reason that they would be so many places. But go ahead.
But I shouldn't take it for granted. But we know, this is what I'm intimating, that they were the ones that had moved everywhere, especially, as I said, from the Grimaldi man moved. The first findings of the Grimaldi man was in a cave in Dusseldorf, where they found they found these findings. And so Africans were all over Europe, not only as the original people, but they were there. The Moors were all over Europe.
You said Grimaldi man. Yeah. I understand that, but you're talking about the African in Europe.
Yeah.
All right, and Homo sapiens sapiens. Just those names would give many people the impression that you're not talking about an African people, a black-skinned people, but some other colored people. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just the name. But go ahead.
If we go by what the scientific evidence that came out by Dr. Diop, we'll understand the monogenetic principle of the different types, the 6 different types that are found in Africa. They were not found anywhere else, and they were bred and found in Africa. And Homo sapiens sapiens, the other types,
they would not have called themselves Homo sapiens sapiens, which is not an African language.
African name. This is what archaeologists and others have called them, anthropologists. But we're talking about African peoples. That's whom we're talking about.
Okay, but African blood in Germany.
Yeah, and so lots of the very early types that what we call they say that is a European phrase from the anthropologists. The Mongoloid African that we're talking about, the African who had a white skin, was white complexion, but again with African hairs and African features and so on. There was a large that type was in Germany for a long time, and it is out of that type that people, if you look at some Germans in the 19th century and before, one example that is given, people use it a lot, and it's true. She comes from that sort. Queen Charlotte, the consort, the wife of George III. She is of that stock, with the kind of frizzy, here, and look at her features again. She knows definitely from all of that stuff. One member of the royal family years and years ago, the Marquis of Milford Haven, admitted all of that. It wasn't something new. It is a thing that is known, but naturally it is kept well under wraps.
So what of Hitler and the pure race?
I have asked that very clearly. There is no such thing as a pure race in Germany. Hitler was hoping to build it pure, but there was no pure Aryan type in Germany. He was trying. This is what he was trying to build through his different camps that he had, through getting rid of a certain type of people and building his camps for young people, camps that he called strength through joy. I forget the German word, but he called it strength through joy, where he was trying to breed a master race, because there is no such thing as a master race. All the archaeologists, all the anthropologists tell you that. I mean, going back to the ancient Britons, by McRitchie, Massey, they all tell you the same thing. Higgins, they all tell you the same thing, that there is no such thing as this thing. The mixture of peoples from the very beginning.
Cress Welsing on white racism. We begin by asking her, how did the attempted extermination of European Jews help her in her analysis of white supremacy behavior?
Well, I'll tell you, this is, I think, very interesting history. I went to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio as an undergrad. And my parents, when I graduated in 1957, my parents said, "What do you want for graduation?" And I said, "Send me to Germany." That was 12 years after the end of the Second World War. I said, "Send me to Germany," because I wanted to live with German people and ask them, did you know what you were doing to your neighbors? You see, so my parents sent me to Germany. And I lived in Germany and would talk to German people and would ask them. And all the German people, they were nice. Francis, come and live in our house. So that was a very, very important kind of information, that people could be nice on the surface, do you see, but they could destroy their neighbor. It was only later that I kept saying, well, what does this term, what does anti-Semitism mean? What does this term Semite really mean? If you look in the dictionary, the word Semite, they say somebody who speaks a Semitic language, but, every third grader knows you don't define a word with the same word. And so I thought about that word because I consider myself a student of what happened in Germany. Read everything about what was that behavior about. And so I suddenly, came to the realization, or the insight came to me, that Semite is from the Latin prefix semi, meaning half. And on the northern tier of Africa, you had, white people, Greek and Roman soldiers coming in and raping African women and producing a mulatto group. That Semite is the same word, you see, that we use over here when we say mulatto. The person who is the mixture of black and white under a system of white domination. And so you had some of those persons, going up into Europe, going north. And so they were in Europe for 2,000 years, but people looked at them as, no matter how much miscegenation went on further with white people in Europe, they were still being looked at as, like, you're a little bit dark. Do you see that you're still colored? And so I say and if you read Mein Kampf and if you read Hitler, or if you listen to the Europeans, do you see, they were talking about, Hitler was talking about, this is an Aryan state, this is white supremacy, this is going to be pure white people. And so the people who historically were, products, their genetic roots went back to Africa, do you see. Many had large noses and their hair still remained frizzy from the genetic material in Africa. But Europe said, we can't digest this and remain white. And so they found themselves killing. Do you see, Germany planned to kill 11 million Semites of the Jewish religion. They succeeded in killing 6. And I maintain that. I have what I call the phrase, the genocidal imperative, do you see, which is when white supremacy gets pushed, it has to destroy large numbers of people that it classifies as non-white. Do you see, as a survival, a cleansing. Now, this is very, very destructive behavior, but I say that it can be analyzed and it can be understood, and it is incumbent upon everybody. It's incumbent upon black people, and it is incumbent upon white people to understand this behavior.
Other than the game of chess, are there other games that you feel mirror white supremacy behavior?
Yes.
What are they?
Take all of the ball games. You see, the ball games are a major preoccupation in the white supremacy system and culture. And I say that, again, it's a reason. In the Cress theory, I said that there's a continuous focusing on color, genetics, and sex. because that focus on color, genetics, and sex is white genetic survival focusing. Okay, so that in this culture, and we could say that, you know, this area of the world called the United States of America is the highest expression of the white supremacy dynamic. You see, everybody flowed from Europe here, and so the dynamic that is going on, goes on everywhere, South Africa, Europe, wherever. Do you see? But this is a major expression and dynamic. And over here, we have all these ball games, and the balls, I say, are representative of the testicles, which are also called balls. You see, the culture says, keep your eye on the ball. Well, at one level, it's a ball game. At another level, it's symbolic conditioning about white genetic survival. Am I making myself clear?
Go ahead.
Okay. If I said, well, what are the two series of ball games that are played in this area of the world, in the white supremacy culture, what would you say?
Ball games?
There are two series of ball games, and you look at it all the time, but not having, you know...
Basketball.
No, that's a...
Football. I'll have to hit it sooner or later. You can tell how much I'm into sports.
Okay, the two series of ball games, and we actually are looking at it all the time, but not having decoded the issue of white genetic survival, we don't see at that level. It's large brown and small white.
Okay. Explain.
All the ball games, the big brown balls are basketball, football, soccer. The small white balls are ping pong, golf, tennis. Now I say that the small white balls are representative of white male testicles. The large brown balls are representative of the black male's testicles. You see, they're all larger. And so if you say, well, what ball games are played by the men that are considered, not by Francis Welsing, but by the culture as the most virile, what games do the men that are considered most virile play? Question.
They have to be football.
Do you see the large brown balls? Do you see? And that's just like the question, who has the largest phallus, the black male or the white? I mean, that's the underlying question in the culture over and over and over again. And I say that that also, you know, represents a preoccupation with the dominant genetic material, do you see, that the black male possesses compared to white males. Do you see? Look at the game of billiards, pool. Do you see where you have a white ball that knocks all the colored balls under the table? The last ball that gets knocked in is a black 8 ball. And so at the end of the game, all the colored balls have been knocked under the table, and the white ball sits on top of the table.
And you say this is no accident.
And that's well, no. Do you see, the brain computer, the brain computer is a fantastic instrument. Do you see? And the brain computer says, what do you want me to do? Do you see? How can I help you survive? Tell me who your enemy is, and then I'll, you know, punch out, you know, basically what it is that you must do. You see, but these are our brain computers.
And after a while, you don't really have to think about it.
You don't have to. You don't have to think about it. You know, like you have it on automatic. You see, but at the same time, you must take responsibility for your brain, whether it's on automatic or whether it's on, you know, conscious control.
Now, how can black children and adults be taught how...
Let me just go back.
Go ahead.
Let me go back even to the smoking objects.
Okay.
Because there are two series of smoking objects in the white supremacy culture.
Just go ahead.
Okay, the same. You see the same thing. Okay, big brown and small white. You see, big brown would be pipes, cigars, and Moors, cigarettes. And small white would be cigarettes. Now, historic within the culture, cigarettes are referred to as fags. Do you see, meaning effeminate? And I say that these are symbolic, the big brown symbolic of black male phallus, and the small white symbolic of white. Now, I don't call them fags. Do you see? But that is within the white culture itself. Do you see? When it looks at, do you see, phallic symbols, black male, white male, they themselves refer to the cigarette. Do you see?
Now give me the series again, because it is very interesting in terms of the color breakdown with games and
See, the whole issue we have to keep in our minds, you know, like a professor of anatomy, the male genitalia, do you see? And the phallus, you know, that's where the symbols of the smoking objects come from, and the ball games, you know, are symbolic of the testicles. And so these issues are being played out and thought out. For example, if I say, what smoking objects do the most intelligent men smoke? The men that are considered most intelligent, what do they smoke?
Either cigars or
pipes.
Pipes, yeah. Okay.
You see, I mean, an intellectual male smokes a pipe, a large brown phallic symbol. The most powerful man smokes a cigar. Do you see? Now, I didn't invent this, but I can, you know, once you decode that the issue is white genetic survival, do you see, then you begin to see this play of symbols that are representative of that. I mean, it's just like decoding, you know, sun tanning. It's just like decoding, you know, the white culture says it hates black and it can't stand black, but they love chocolate. Do you see? Constantly taking chocolate into the body. Do you see? And saying chocolate, eating chocolate is an erotic experience. Black people don't think like that. Do you see? But again, it's like, well, we have a deficiency, a color deficiency, and so if you think you have a color deficiency, you will want to put brown substance in your body. Do you see? And so all of the, from chocolate, all of the major drinks are dark brown or coffee, tea, chocolate. You see, it's like when I went to Germany years ago, their favorite candy was a little chocolate baby doll, and that they referred to as nigger babies. That was the favorite candy.
In where now?
In Germany. Nigger babies, that's what they were called. You see? And Germany recently, I don't know how long ago, somebody will know, but Germany at a certain point, you know, maybe what, 15 years ago, said, well, we're drinking Coca-Cola. See, even Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, all these dark drinks that people who, you know, feel this deficiency. But Germany said, well, we, you know, need to have our own national cola. Why are we drinking Coca-Cola? That's from the United States. And so they developed their own cola. What do you think they called it?
What do they call it?
Afri-Cola. A-F-R-I, from Africa, has a palm tree on the bottle. Now, you see, why would that? I mean, you would think it would be Deutsche Cola, do you see? But why Afri-Cola as, you know, the major drink to balance out Coca-Cola in that culture?
How can black children and adults be taught how to decode white supremacy, symbols, and language?
Well, again...
Probably very difficult to...
Well, no, because I wrote about this in the crest theory. For example, one of the things I focused on in writing about the crest theory is, you know, white people, large numbers of white people, was a preoccupation to talk about black people are genetically inferior to white people compared, you know, in terms of intelligence. They are genetically inferior. They are genetically inferior. That's still being said. We can't find anybody qualified. Do you see? These are all various ways of talking, you know, for the white population to talk about black genetic inferiority. But I say that the reason that anybody would say, you know, if I kept saying, you are genetically inferior, Listerveld, you are genetically inferior, you are genetically inferior, then you say, so I wonder why Frances is preoccupied about talking about genetic inferiority. Perchance, does she feel genetically inadequate? You see, and so I say that black people have to begin to understand white supremacy, the white psyche, as a science. And so that they will understand, you see, all this constant projection, something's wrong with you, something's wrong with you, something's wrong with you, that this is what they are feeling about themselves. A person who feels whole doesn't have to, you see, keep talking about somebody else is inadequate and something is wrong with the other person.
Along with that, how do you read the preoccupation that European scholars have with finding the origin of humanity. I mean, who else?
Because they can't deal with the fact that actually we had black mothers and fathers, and we are albino mutants from the black people. I mean, that doesn't fit with talking about white genetic superiority. Do you see? And so that, no, we've got to find, there has to be the origin. But, you know, science says, you know, what's the simplest explanation? And we see the formation of albinos all the time. I mean, albino mice coming from, you know, albino chickens, albino, even in...
Albino chickens?
Sure. I mean, if you look at the turkeys that we eat at Thanksgiving, now they're all albino turkeys. They were, you know, big black birds with, you know, red heads, and so now they're, you know, they've developed a mutant.
After we did a program with you in the early 80s, I was looking at television down in Berkeley County, Pineville, South Carolina. I give them, my folks a plug down there. And there was a PSA on which said, quote, "The polar bear evolved from the brown bear." And my mind went straight back to the conversation that we had, and that was very interesting to me.
Well, see, I say that this is, you know, again, I wish I could be the czar in terms of the education of the white population on the planet, because I would say, you know, try to get into the mode of respecting yourselves, do you see, as white, and respecting the fact that you are a minority on the planet. Do you see? Stop all of this posturing, talking about other people, do you see, are minorities, and other people are supposed to be less than. Do you see? Because that really is demeaning you. It causes you to do very destructive things to other people. Do you see? It really, in no sense. So what if you are, do you see, an albino? But I think what happened thousands and thousands of years ago in Africa, that when the black population, for whatever reasons, was producing albino mutants, do you see, that what they did with that mutant population, the same thing that we do today with genetic defective populations or persons, we put them in institutions away from. See, there probably is in South Carolina an institution for genetic defective individuals. Do you see? You take them out of the breeding group. And so I think that the black people in Africa extruded the albino mutants. Do you see? Didn't kill them, but put them out of the, you know, major population groups. And just to survive, that population would find itself migrating north, where there's less sun intensity, because if indeed they were producing, if the black population was producing large numbers of albino mutants, and the albino mutants remained in the black population, so you had a buildup of recessive genetic genes for, you know, for albinism, then the black population would not have the survivability, do you see, in an area of the world like Africa. And I think the same thing happened with the San Blas Indians in Panama. It's a group of brown people, Indian population in Panama, that was producing large numbers of albino mutants, and so they wouldn't let the albino mutants marry. They couldn't marry in, so you didn't get a buildup of the albino genetic trait, do you see? And so they, you know, they call them the moon children or the moon people. And that's still, you know, going on to this day. So I think that the black people put the albinos out.
This is what you believe?
I believe that, do you see, in other words, if you try to say, well, how might this have happened? And it seems in terms of how it has played out behaviorally speaking, because if the albinos were put out and so then they stayed in Europe and became a white population, do you see, by intermarrying with each other, then you would just produce a white population that would still be genetic recessive to the dominant black population that was the parent population. And so when we look at what does Rome say, Rome, the founding of the state of Rome was, you know, the founders of the state of Rome were Romulus and Remus, and they were suckled by a wolf. Now this means that they did not have their parents. If a wolf had to take care of them, they didn't have their parents. So now follow this. That European population, hundreds of years later, goes into Africa, takes African people out, brings the African people to the area of the world that we now call the United States, and says, now you're going to nurse and take care of the white baby. Do you see? And so then the white population would call the black population mammy and pappy and auntie and uncle. Do you follow what I'm saying? So that it's as though the black people put them out, and then it was within the white psyche, well, we are going to now take you out of Africa and make you take care of the whites' baby that you had rejected in the past. So sometimes talking to white people, I say, you know, maybe we have to take responsibility, or I'll take responsibility. Maybe we were the first child abusers. Do you see? And so when you abuse children, then they end up abusing people. And so white people are being very abusive to black people now. So maybe that goes all the way back in time.
Maybe.
Well, do you see, but the point is that that doesn't mean continue. Do you see? That doesn't mean, well, okay, so if we put the albino mutants out and then they formed the white population in Europe and then they came back and mistreated the black population, that you just say, well, let's just go on. No. Okay, if we did that to you and you're upset about it, then we're very sorry, but we're going to stop this injustice that is now going on the planet, because this is not right.
You practice general and child psychiatry. From your vantage point, and we've already discussed this, I know, at some level, but anyway, from your vantage point, how is white supremacy impacting on African American adults and children?
Okay.
What are you seeing at your office?
Well, not only at my office, in the society. You see, that the white supremacy dynamic, as I've posited, is a white genetic survival dynamic. And white genetic survival depends on checkmating the black king, putting the black man in check. When the black man is placed in check, do you see, through unemployment, underemployment, then the black family goes into collapse. Do you see, families have to have mothers and fathers. If you take, you know, if you take one father out of a neighborhood, do you see, then the child who doesn't have a father can make up the difference with the other fathers. But when you take 90% of the fathers out by a dynamic, do you see, you have really crippled the entire people. So that when the father is removed and he cannot play the role as breadwinner, and the mother play the role as, you know, the support giver of the emotional well-being of the children, then you're going to produce certain kinds of behavioral aberrations. If the mother is forced to be the breadwinner as well as the giver of emotional supports, you see, then the emotional supports go wanting. You can produce depression. You see, if a mother, you know, if that balance is not there, the father as the breadwinner, the mother as the primary emotional support of the developing child, if that's not in place, then you can produce symptoms of depression in children. Now, if children are depressed, these are some of the things that they will do. If children are suffering depression and dependency deprivation, they will become preoccupied with sex prematurely, and so therefore we get teenage pregnancy. They will not have the necessary emotional supports to tackle academic work, so we get school dropouts. a sufficient degree of depression, somebody says, well, here, if you drink this, you won't feel so bad, little boy. Or if you take this drug, you won't feel so bad. You'll feel real cool. Do you see? And so that's the way I say that we get teenage pregnancy, we get school dropping out, and we get use of drugs. If you take large numbers of fathers out of a community, and male children do not have fathers to model their behavior after and to lean against so that they gain strength and confidence in themselves as male children, then you will have children forming together in gangs. You see, engaging in destructive activity. So I see that all of these plays are, do you see, coming about because the white king is, you know, in our analogy, do you see, put the black king in check. And black people have not understood these dynamics, do you see, or they knew something was happening and they were begging for it to stop, do you see, but it can't stop. And so I say that now, once we make this analysis of what the dynamic of white supremacy is really all about, then we have to go into certain kinds of behavior formation. And one of the kinds of behavior formation is because, see, now we have an epidemic of teen pregnancy. And there's no way in the world that a teenager can rear a child to emotional maturity. Do you see? That's not possible. Okay. So I say that we have to understand that this dynamic, white genetic survival dynamic that has checkmated the black king or put the black man in check, do you see, this is going on. But if we begin to understand that that is happening and then consciously codify our behavior, this is on the black side of the chessboard now, so that I have a rule: no black woman under the conditions of white supremacy should have a child before she's 30. No black male should become a father until he's 35.
Power. Good evening and welcome to For the People and the second part of our conversation with Mr. Haki R. Madhubuti. We begin by putting this question to the writer, poet, and publisher. What do you think is the proper role? Maybe role is not the word. I'm trying to get at the place of European culture in the African-American child, adult's life, but especially now the African-American child. What do you think is the...
Well, we deal with this almost every day. In our school. Our school is about 20-some odd years old now. And we service the entire black, community, spectrums of that community. And from the very poor to upper middle class. I mean, we got the children of lawyers and judges in our school, as well as welfare, our parents. And that's always one of the most important questions. What do you mean by black education? What do you mean by African-based education? And what we mean by African-based education at one level is really the mode and the quality of the teaching itself. One of the things I say in Plan the Planet is you don't send your children to be taught by those who do not love them. Okay, and the environment and the atmosphere is very important in terms of our school. That just the way we refer to the teacher, say a teacher, her name may be Shalewa, but the child refers to the teacher as Mama Shalewa. And so if I'm teaching in the school, that would be Baba Haki, which means Father Haki, or Mama Haki, which means that the children, when they're among us, they're our children. We're their parents, you see. So therefore, the whole connection is just different from the beginning, okay? Two, when we talk about African-based education, we're talking about putting ourselves in the context of that education. That we're not tangential to it. You see, we're not like on the border of the circle, we're in the circle, okay? And which means essentially we're participating in the development of not only the child's minds and bodies and spirit, but we have been involved in the development of civilization period. See, heretofore, the education that I received, which was basically white studies or European studies, is that I never saw myself in the mix. The mix was always helping white folks, okay? So it was like, you know, going with the wind in elementary school and high school and university level. Well, our children coming up today, most certainly in our schools and schools like ours, and even many public schools today, see themselves as not starting with slave history. They see themselves as basically the developers of civilization, that we participate in the development of civilization. And this is not feel good, it's just accurate. I mean, so now, what do you say about European participation in education? I think we cannot take the position that Europe did not give anything of value to the world. That would just be incorrect, okay? That we look at that which Europe has provided to the world that has been beautiful and necessary and developmental, and we use it and teach it in that context, okay? But at the same time, we're not going to lie about what Europe has done in the destruction of the world, okay? And so we have to balance that out. And in balancing it out, we put ourselves into the mix also in terms of what we done in terms of the development too. So it's a very, very delicate road, but it's one that has made our children more involved in the education process. In fact, when our children come out of our school, they're about two grades ahead, because we're teaching them very early to think, you see. And so not just sit down and listen to what the teacher is saying or not saying, but to participate in the educational process.
In your opinion, what should be the ultimate political and economic goal of African Americans? What should we be striving for?
Well, I would say liberation. And when I mean liberation, I think that when you talk about liberated people, at some point, liberated people talk very clearly about the land that they own or control, the businesses that they have developed and they're sharing with other people, the educational system that they have influenced and, of course, are teaching their children, the type of communities in which they live in and control and have a lot of say-so over. You see what I'm saying? What all too often is that we confuse freedom. Well, see, what has happened in America, we have the freedom to self-destruct, okay? Drugs exist in the black community not because black people are somehow inherently addicted to a drug culture, okay? Alcoholism, I'm saying that what has been put on us has allowed us to move toward a mode or a living style of self-destruction rather than developmental. I said, for instance, who said black people need to party every weekend? Okay? That when you begin to look at other people who are developing around the world, say the Japanese or others, you don't see them partying every weekend.
Say that again, please. Who said
that black people need to party every weekend? That when you spend it, not only do we party every weekend, we spend maybe the week outside of our community looking for what we're going to party in. So we spend our money outside of the community to come back to the community and party, and in many ways it's just not developmental. That's not to say that we cannot have fun. I'm not saying that. I'm saying essentially that things have to be put into their place. That what we teach our children, most certainly, is that rather than strive toward being a great athlete, what about being another W.B. Du Bois, or Shirley Graham Du Bois, you see, or Queen Mother Moore, John Henry Clark? You see the point I'm trying to make? Is that we develop different types of heroes, okay, and that means that we have to pull them away from the mass media, you see, and deal with our children. So when I say liberation, I'm saying at one point, liberation not only physically, but how does one liberate the mind? Okay, and that's so important. I think that when the mind is liberated, that means that it gives you the capacity to see things clear. That gives you the capacity to make decisions that you normally probably would not make. In fact, it gives you the capacity to understand the difference between a decision and a choice. And what happens all too often today, that black folk and many folk who are oppressed like us, we make choices within the parameters of other people's decisions. You see what I'm saying? That people have made decisions about, well, here are your 5 choices for the superintendent. Now you choose one. The decision has been made. One is going to be the
So the circle has already been...
Right, it's been drawn. You see, so we tap dance within the context of the circle. I'm saying that a liberated mind says that we're going to create the circle. A liberated mind says that I am not going to follow this agenda. I got my own agenda. Okay, and for me,
will people ever think like that if they are able to buy what they want to buy? You know, because many times if people can just, if they can afford to buy whatever's produced, then that's enough.
Well, most certainly, yeah. You're right about that. I mean, certainly material culture has been an impediment to our development. That's true, but what is happening that material culture has also put a whole lot of people into debt, serious debt. You got a lot of black folks now who are living from check to check, trying to get out of debt. And let me just, again, try to be very clear about where we are in terms of this country. America's riches, for the most part, has not touched the great majority of black folk. There is a mobile, vocal, serious black middle class. But it's landless, and it doesn't have a great deal of money, very little discretionary funds. You see, you have some individuals that have money. You see, but for the most part, the black middle class does not have a lot of money. But, as you mentioned, the black middle class does have access to the material culture. Homes, cars, washing machines, et cetera, et cetera. And that's very important. But the great majority of the world, and I think this is what we have to understand as the world people, that you find today now in Southern Africa, there's famine. I mean, there is serious drought, which means that thousands of babies are dying per day. Not hundreds, but literally thousands. Okay, you go to other parts of the world, you see similar things happening. This country, in all its vast wealth, for the most part, uses something like 60-70% of the world's natural resources. And you got maybe 7% of the world's population here. Okay? The Rio conference was about that. I mean, how do you change that inequality? Okay? Where this country comes to Rio, high and mighty, talking about their advocates of the environment, okay, where, and going to preach to, say, the people in Brazil or in so-called third world countries. But for the most part, people, I mean, it's really obscene at one point to look at the expressways and see all these cars out here and one person in the car. Okay? I mean, the country's not moving toward any type of environmental policy for the most part. And all I'm saying to you is that, yes, we have bought into the material culture. And I think that what we have to become more sensitive to are that there is serious poverty in this world. And by our buying into this culture, we participate in the poverty of the world. Now, that takes a very committed man and woman to begin to cut back, you see. But I think that in terms of being a liberated man or woman, what we need to be involved in is that how do we develop lives that are consistent with saving the planet, saving the earth, while at the same time using our resources to help develop our own community. That's what a liberated mind does.
How many African-American colleges are teaching that?
Very few. I would say, and I used to teach at 2 of the black colleges, but I would think that at the most 2 or 3 are kind of involved in it. But, you know, we all do what we've been taught to do. Okay, that in many cases these black colleges and universities have boards that are not trying to move toward an African-centered education. They're still working out of a European paradigm, and one understands that. However, you do have some now colleges and universities, for instance, Spelman with Janetta Cole. She's trying to move in an African-centered direction. The university I'm at in Chicago State, we have a new black woman president. She's trying to do that. Dr. Dolores Cross, she's trying to do the same thing. I think Howard just got a new progressive president. So there are glimmers of hope on the horizon, you see. But at the same time, all across the country, you have neighborhood groups and community groups and cultural centers where black men and women are working very diligently to bring a new perspective. You see, to our
the Rodney King LA disturbance will get a lot of attention from social scientists. How do you see those disturbances?
Well,
those events, yeah.
I'm editing a book on the Rodney King. It's called What Happened in L.A. I was very disturbed.
I'm glad I asked you.
I am very disturbed about what happened in L.A. And primarily about the reportage that came about as a result of that from the major media, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek Time, and U.S. World Report, that I felt was very superficial. And one of the major problems I felt with the reportage was that it was just a riot. you see, and we see it as rebellion or insurrection. That here in L.A. you have a community that is very close proximity to each other, where you have the obscene rich and you have the obscene poor, okay? And here you have the poor that's locked out. Forget jobs. There's just not any jobs. Forget employment. But locked out of the whole cultural scene, the educational scene. You see, and so here you have young men primarily who do not see their stake in this country at all. In 1990, I served on the National Commission on Crime and Justice, which was set up by the American Friends Service Committee. They're the Quakers out of Philadelphia who founded the prison system in this country about 200 years ago. They pulled together this commission to see why the prison system was not working. And for a year, the commission members, about 27 men and women from different ethnic backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds, we visited prisons, we had hearings across the country, and most certainly what we found was astonishing. That, and this hooks into the whole LA situation, that today you have about 1 million men and women locked up. Out of that 1 million, 752,000 are black men and Latino men. 752,000. You see what I'm saying? So you're out of 1 million, all right? And these are men between the ages of 18 and 29. Between the 18 and 29, these are the warrior years. These are the years that young men feel they are the strongest, that they can do anything, you see. And these are the years that, of course, the military takes them into the armed forces. Why? Because they'll take orders and they're ready to fight somebody, okay? And so what has happened, the culture and the system that we lived in has locked us into these cities, has locked us into these urban areas with no hope, and trapped us in a way that there's, so the young men are being trapped into crime, the young men are being trapped into doing things which they normally would not do, but they're now in a survival mode. And so the young men are being removed from our communities like sand in a windstorm. And so the greatest force that confronts these young men on a daily basis will be the police forces in these various areas. And as most people know by now, LA is like the Gestapo of police forces in the country. And so when the Rodney King incident happened, we were not surprised, having studied this whole situation, having interviewed black policemen across the country. What was a surprise, of course, it was caught on camera. Okay. Now, obviously, before the policeman being released and not indicted was a surprise to all of us. You see, and even to myself. I said, well, look, this evidence is just overwhelming that, you know, look. And so when they were released, we knew that L.A. was going to go. We knew that. I mean, it was like no question. And so we see it as again, another slap in the back. And so having L.A. go like that, what we decided to do, then we need to have another perspective, that we cannot just depend upon what white folks are saying about what happened. And so with this new book coming out, What Happened in L.A., we've gotten some of the best minds in the country to write commentary on it and put it in a historical mode, as well as looking at it contemporarily also.
So how do you view the so-called, to use the press's word, rioters? How do you think, go ahead.
Well, again, I don't see them as the great majority of them as rioters.
Right.
I think that you are going to have an element that's going to take advantage of any situation. So that's not to say that 100% of the young people out there who were not only black, but they were white, and Asian, and Latino too. I think
why was it that it was portrayed as just a black thing?
I think it's most convenient. You see, one of the things that you have to understand about America is that you have less than 1 or 2% in this country that control the wealth of the country. And what that 1 or 2%, most certainly say 5% of people would like to do is to stop us from ever talking about money. Okay? Have you heard any of the candidates who are running for president talk about the savings and loan debacle? No. You're talking about $500 billion gone. You're talking about the great majority of people who would participate in that will never see jail. You see? In fact, you're talking about many of those persons who would participate in the savings and loan rip-off, they're now buying property that was taken from them. They're buying it back, okay? And what I'm saying essentially is that what this country would like us to do is to focus on the whole race thing, but not from a point of view where we are trying to liberate ourselves and get to know each other and move at another level. They're trying to make sure that the race war continues. Okay? Why? Because once you start talking about money, and once you begin to at one point talk about the whole class differentiations in this country, then you begin to see where a lot of this white supremacy stems from. All right? And that's not going to happen as long as we don't control serious media in the country. What will happen shortly after the November election, the banks are going. You see, the banks are in serious trouble now. Just prior to Bush being elected, we knew about the savings and loan debacle, what was happening there, but it didn't come out until after he was in office, you see. And so the race card will be played not in our favor, always be played as we are the scapegoats. But the problem in the country is that black folks are trying to do this, and black folks are trying to move here, black folks are trying to do that. And then, of course, now, with brown folks, Latinos too, will become a dominant population somewhere past the 21st century.
And now, at least, the presidential candidates are talking about the urban areas. Would that have happened if
not at
without L.A.?
No, and of course, Clinton is probably the major one. At least he's put out a plan. But Ross Perot and Bush, they are still reacting, you see, and of course blaming the 60s, you see, which is childish at best.
One of your books is entitled Black Men, Obsolete, Single, Dangerous, the African-American Family in Transition. What's in that title?
Well, black men are seen primarily as the major boogeyman in America. That you turn on our television sets at night, and the major criminals that are depicted are black men. You talk about the drug problem in the country, and the commentators say, well, it's black men. All right. You talk about any problems, then the focus is basically on black men. Now, what is very clear to me, and this is what I try to clear from the book, is that race America doesn't have a race problem. America is a race problem. All right? White men run it. They don't run after it. They run it. They control all the areas of human activity. Sports, law, economics, education, you see, healthcare, one go on and on. All right? White men do not fear white women. White men and white women are partners, be it senior and junior partners. White women are not satisfied with white men. That's why they have a fairly strong and active white feminist movement. Okay. But in the final analysis, white women do realize that they're going to have to go back to white men if the white race is to perpetuate itself. You see, anytime white mates outside of white, you don't get white, you get confusion. All right? So we know that whites will have to continue to mate with each other to replicate themselves. White men do not fear black women collectively. Individually, yes, but collectively, no. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that when you look at the mixed race among the world, and most certainly look at our people in this country, you see the differentiation of colors in the black community. That's because white men raped black women. All right? White men do fear black men, individually and collectively, for any number of reasons. Well, one of the greatest fears is, would black men do to white men if they were in power what white men have done to black men over the last millennium, you see. That's a great fear. It's a great fear. And so what is very, very, very clear to me is that the systems and subsystems are geared toward the misdevelopment of the greatest threat, which are the men. Now, I must be very clear that oppression is oppression, you see, and black women are under the same oppression that black men receive.
And have to carry.
You see, and have to carry it even at a greater level. Why? Because as the men are wiped out, or as the men are neutralized and put into prisons, or neutralized in any other ways, black women are left in the communities with the children. You see, and therefore you have over 60%.
Do you think we see that though?
I think some of us see it.
Do you think we see that, or do we just look at some black men who may leave their families or whatever and say, "Oh, you're sorry, you're just sorry, you're just sorry, you're just sorry," or or do we see what's behind that?
You see, what is happening in our community did not happen overnight. And what I try to explain to black men is that over the last 25 years, we have seen a deterioration of the black community, brought on in part by basically white supremacy, but also a misunderstanding of what integration is and what integration can and cannot do. You see, that, I mean, I grew up partially in the South, but even in the up South and northern parts of the cities, prior to integration, we had pretty stable communities. Why? Because we knew that we had to depend upon each other, that we knew that we had to develop our own businesses, that we knew we had to essentially develop our own educational system, et cetera, et cetera. What integration brought, or misintegration brought, was somehow we began to let down the guard, those forces. We felt that everything was all right. You see, now we can go to the malls, we can, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened also was that the federal program brought into existence the aid to parents with dependent children,
right?
Which essentially forced black men out of the homes. Okay, and as a result of that, the whole economy is changing. Understand that the economy is changing. You're going from an industrial-based, agricultural-based economy to an economy today that's based upon services and information gathering. Okay, which means a whole new technology, which black people had not been trained to involve in. So in the latter part of the 60s, you brought white women back into the economy because now it's getting to a point where one salary cannot even support one white home. So white women came back into the economy, forcing black men out and forcing black women out of the economy, okay? As a result of that, no jobs what began to develop was an underground economy within the context of the black community. The underground economy is not something new, but because when Jews came here or when the Polish and Irish came, they had to participate in the underground economy. Why? Because they couldn't join the WASP economy until they got to a certain point. But what happened, the difference between our underground economy and their underground economy, for the most part, it is driven by drugs that was forced into the black community from the white community. You see? Now, you cannot develop a community or an economy on drugs because at the same time, it's destroying you. You see? And that's where we are today. So I'm saying that where we are now is not an overnight trip. It's taken some 25, 30 years to get there. And it's deliberate. It's not accidental at all.
What would you say, not to every black woman, single parent, presumably woman, who's raising children or children by herself, the man is wherever.
Yeah.
What would you say to her in terms of how things came to be?
Well, I would try to give that explanation that I just gave, but at the same time, I would tell her that it is important if she plans to survive with her child or children, that she needs a loving, extended family. She needs a network. And this extended family could be other sisters in similar conditions, or could be a biological family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and so forth. But she cannot raise that child for the most part, especially the younger she gets, the more difficult. The younger she is, the more difficult it is to do by herself. And I say this not only in terms of as a researcher, you see, and just seeing what's going on around the country, but also as a parent. That my wife and I, we have our 3 children. And it's extremely difficult, you see, with the type of information bank that both of us have to raise these 3 children. You see, we live in a 3-generation home. My wife's mother lives with us. Okay, so I don't buy the mother-in-law jokes. She's my mother too.
Yeah,
okay?
Me either, but mine doesn't live with me.
And so, but it's very important to have this extended family because my wife could not have gone back and, say, for instance, complete this PhD without my mother being there. You see.
intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which will ever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And as much as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding blacks and tawnies of increasing the lovely white and red?
Good evening and welcome to For the People and the second part of our conversation with Dr. Donna M. Richards, author of Urugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. In this segment, Dr. Richards discusses, among other things, the role the Greek philosopher Plato played in creating the European way of thinking and behaving. But first, we begin with this question. As you say, other cultures have exhibited aggression, imperialistic tendencies. What accounts for Europe's success?
I'm glad you got to that question. Because what it allows me to do, I think, is to get at what I think is the specialness of the approach, the method that I used in this study. So it's going to take me a little while, if that's okay. I said to myself that, and this definitely was with the help of the ancestors, I want to, affirm that, by the way, that it was not...
Why is that important?
That's important because of our concept of connectedness, our concept of the universe, that it's not just words to talk of a spiritual universe and our spirituality as a people, but we've got to understand where our energy comes from. And I know that that's where mine came from. So this is ours. This belongs to us. I had to say, how would I approach studying the European given African conceptions? You see, it's one thing to say, okay, I want to do this, but then use their conceptions. What does it mean for us to really think in African terms? And so what I did was to develop concepts that came from an African worldview, not a European worldview. And I came up with the concept of asili. I also used African language. That's a Kiswahili word that means seed, origin, the essence of something. The reason that was important was because what people would say is, and they will say, oh, Europe is so vast. It is, there's so many different kinds of European forms and different countries. How can you talk about Europe as a whole? Now, of course, they've been talking about Europe as a whole all of this time, but when we begin to look at them, suddenly it's going to be, no, you can't really do this because it's too diverse. I needed a concept which could explain a culture in terms of its core, in terms of its ideological core, so that you could look at every different aspect of the culture and see how it fit into this one seed or core. And that's why I used the asili. And the idea of the seed was that once that asili is in place, that cultural asili, that it will seek to fulfill itself. So the way in which the culture will develop will all be feeding into that asili. And that would help me to get at consistency in terms of European development. What throws us as a people is that we make exceptions. You know, we say, oh, well, that's different over here, and that's different. This is a good one over here, and this doesn't really work that way. But in my analysis, it's all consistent, and it's all working for one purpose, And the concept of Asili helped me to see that. And that comes to the answer to your question, is that what I was able to do was to see that the nature of the European Asili was to seek power. That it, in essence, is, we could almost say it is an Asili which lacks wholeness, and therefore must always see. Go back to Yurugu now. Remember Yurugu as the incomplete being that is always must be seeking, but can never be fulfilled because he can't get the complementary part of himself. Their Asili, the European cultural Asili, is incomplete, must always be seeking. Now, it cannot be fulfilled through spirit because they have no knowledge of spirit, no relationship to spiritual reality. Therefore, fulfillment is sought through power. And power here means power over other. And what that means is that everything within the culture, all of the development of European culture, all of the forms, all of the institutions, the ideas even, are all for the purpose of achieving European power. Now, your question was, if we can recognize that there have been imperialistic behaviors in other cultures, then what is the difference between European culture and these other cultures? And the answer is that Europeans have been most successful at achieving world domination because everything within the culture supports the quest for domination.
Everything.
Everything. Mm-hmm. Including, and most importantly to me, their philosophical concepts, including their concept of truth, including their academies, academia, the intellectuals, including that. It works for, including Christianity as it manifests itself, within the European development. All of that works for the achievement of European power.
Okay. What would you say are the main features of African cultural thought and behavior that separate it from European cultural thought and behavior?
I think that that's a good question, because even to understand the nature of European culture and how it works, what we need to begin with is the African worldview and how it works. That provides a frame of reference that you can then use. The African concept of the universe is as a spiritual whole, where everything is interrelated. That means that what is emphasized is not only spirit, but connectedness. And that we conceive of ourselves, we experience ourselves, I should say, as spiritual beings, that as almost as cosmic beings. And by that I mean that we are connected to nature, to the forces of nature, to each other, in such a way that that's where we get definition and that's where we get strength. And so power for us becomes energy, the energy to do, to make things happen. We energize each other. Interaction becomes important. Complementarity becomes important. The relationship between spirit and matter is one in which they are connected, where material reality is understood as just the way spirit manifests itself. That's simply. On the other hand, in the European worldview and way of thinking, way of looking at the universe, human beings become separate and distinct individuals. The only way that you can know anything about the universe is to separate yourself from it, to take connectedness out of it, and thereby create what they call the object. That's all that you can know. Now, this object is a thing. that has no